Hi, I'm Steve, you're watching Gear Stuff and Things, and today we're going to talk about making a guitar tone in Helix Native. Stick around. Alright, so we're going to jump into Logic, and I'm just going to show you what I would do to create a tone in Line6 Helix Native. Obviously, everyone has different tonal preferences. For me personally, I tend to lean in a certain direction when dealing with guitar tones, especially with stuff that's more rock and or metal based. If I was doing something that's more doom oriented, like I would in my band Close the Hatch, I have a completely different amp setup and process for how I would achieve the tone I want there. But for this, we're going to go with something that's a little more flexible and something that can take us from just your average classic rock, hard rock tone into a metal tone with very little change as far as your patch. And if you're doing the snapshot thing in Helix, if you're familiar with that, you can actually save it as a snapshot with some things on and with some things off. But for the intents and purposes of this video, we are just going to get into making the basic tone. So I'm going to jump into Logic now, and we're going to pull up Helix Native. If you have a traditional Helix unit, you can do the same thing. Helix Native and the Helix hardware all share this software, so it's very easy to get in and make these changes no matter which version of it you have. Obviously, if you're dealing with the HX Stomp, you're going to have less blocks to mess with. But in this instance, we are using Native, so that's pretty close to if you were using the rack or the LT or the floor unit. So we don't have a limitation to blocks here, but I tend to try to be minimal should I decide to use something with less options down the road to keep things more flexible. It's great to really go nuts and change things, but it's also good to have something that's simple and effective. So let's start by adding an amp. For me personally, I tend to lean towards stuff that's more mid-range focused. So I'll go with a Marshall type tone, or occasionally I'll head towards like a Soldano or something within Helix Native, especially when dealing with a baritone and for more rock oriented approaches or metal oriented approaches. So what we're going to use today, and what is kind of my go-to in Helix Native in general, is the Placator Dirty, which is Line6's answer to the Friedman. And another thing of note, I tend to always, especially with dealing with more aggressive tones or like hard rock tones or metal tones, go into the host section, turn that internal noise gate on, your ears will be saved, and you're better for it in the long run. So let's move on to the cabinet, and for this I'm using an impulse response from ML Sound Labs. I recently got their Djent Mega Djent cab. I'm not a huge Djent fan personally. I do like Meshuggah, but beyond that, not a lot of those bands do anything for me. But the cabinet and the impulse responses in that cabinet are amazing. Regardless of the genre, they sound fantastic. So we're just going to pick one for the intents and purposes of this video. So we're going to go with this 57B, which is an SM57. I tend to do all of my post-processing with guitar stuff inside of Helix, which allows me to cut back on using as much processing within Logic. It's a little easier on your CPU down the road, especially when you start adding layers and multiple tracks. So for the intents and purposes of this, I'm going to go ahead and take the low cut to around 80. If it's too much, or you're finding things to be too boomy, you take it down to 100. Do whatever works for you and whatever sounds best to you. But for me personally, 80 works. I'm going to bring the high cut down to about 10K, and that's enough. I don't want to lose everything in the high end. I still want a little bit of the sparkle, a little bit of the chime. So I still keep some of it there, but I want to get rid of some of that unnecessary hiss stuff. Again, this is more of a personal preference thing. Obviously, you're going to have a different taste in how you approach it. This is just how I would do it. So from there, we're going to move on to an overdrive. Now with this particular amp, I tend to go with the Minotaur. The Tube Screamer sounds fine, and the OCD copy, which they call the Compulsive Drive, sounds great too. But it's a little less controlled in my opinion, and I feel like the Tube Screamer kind of takes some of the life out of this particular patch. So I go with the Minotaur. It's a little bit more gnarly, but it definitely adds some flavor to the Placater Dirty. So I don't put a ton of dirt on it. I drop things down to about 1.5 on the gain. I do bring up the tone a bit. So somewhere around 6 is about where I stick with it. We'll call it 5.9 since it's not wanting to cooperate. And the level I'm gonna bring up to around 8. So we're hitting the amp pretty hard up front. And let's just go ahead and hear what that sounds like. Sounds pretty good. Let's make a few tweaks here. So I'm going to bring down the tone a tiny bit on the overdrive. It's a bit much, but this should clean it up a tiny bit. Less brittle. Again, this may seem like a thinner tone to someone who is just hearing the guitar by itself, but what's important to note here is that you want the bass to do its job and you want the guitar to do its job. The guitar is a mid-range instrument. It should sit in the mid-range. So I'm really leaning things, particularly with baritone guitar, to live in the mid-range and to the mid-high area, because you want the low frequencies of the bass to really carry the ass, for a lack of a better term, with your mix. So let's hear what we got again. That's my high gain tone. So let's remove the overdrive from the front of the amp, and we're going to get back to a little bit more of a regular hard rock tone. Sounds great. It's still pretty aggressive and would work in a lot of different settings, but by rolling off the volume a bit on the guitar, you can get a little bit more of a classic rock feel, bringing your volume, get a little bit more of a hard rock vibe, and you can really dig in and get what you need out of it. This is just keeping the patch very simple. We're going to move on from there to some other things that I tend to add just for taste. For me personally, I tend to like a bit of delay. It's not always on, but when it is on, I don't keep it too bathed, but enough to be heard. So that's there, especially if I was doing a lead or something of this sort. It would be useful to bring that to life and bring it to the surface a little bit more. So we'll drop that out. And another thing I always leave on is a tiny bit of reverb. With inside Helix, I tend to lean on the legacy stuff, and I go with the 69 spring reverb because it's pretty close to a traditional spring reverb, and I drop it down quite a bit. It's not really overly present, but it's there. It gives a little bit of life and room to your overall sound. Again, not terribly present, but it's there enough to make it not feel stale, and it kind of makes things feel a little less digital to me by adding that. I realize all of this is digital, but adding a little bit of character and a little bit of that room feel to what you're doing is always pretty cool. And that's a good way to get some of that vibe happening. I realize it's a spring reverb, not a room reverb, but you get what I'm getting after. I hope you do. And that's always on for me. So if I was using this in Helix as a snapshot, I would save a snapshot as you see here, and then I would save a snapshot with the overdrive in front of it, so that you could hear that I could bring it, in and out. I tend to keep the volume section in front of everything, just in case I was to use it with an actual Helix down the road. I'll have a little bit of control with a volume or expression pedal in front instead of using the guitar knob so much. And that's pretty much it. So if you were using a HX Stomp and you had the limit of 6 blocks for this preset in particular, you would be able to accomplish that using only 5. The volume block you could actually probably put buried in your signal chain and just part of it all the time. So that would leave you an open block to add something else should you want to.
Oh, great, you're still there. If you're new to the channel and you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit the button right down there. Make sure you hit that notifications bell so that YouTube lets you know every time I post a new video. And if you like the content you see here and you'd like to support the channel further, I've included a bunch of links in the description with ways to do that.
So hopefully you found this informative. I know there are plenty of videos on this subject online, but I'd had a few questions about tones I was using, and this is just one of the tones I use as a basic patch when doing my YouTube videos here. So if you hear anything that's more metal or rock oriented on my videos, it tends to be this amp with a couple of variables here and there. And yeah, that's it. So thanks so much for stopping by. And until next time, it's been me, it's been you. This is Gear Stuff and Things. That's a candle. That's an empty bottle of whiskey that I did not drink. I don't really drink. Sorry, I'm pretty boring. Anyhow, I hope you are all safe and healthy and happy and with family. And that's it. Bye.